When you hear this sound at the start of the match, how do you feel? Back in 2016, you would probably feel fear, excitement, and you knew you were going to have a very intense and fun game. But nowadays, most of the people probably will think that they are lucky it's not another Albert Wesker. What happened to one of the best killers in Dead by Daylight? The one killer that most survivors feared and that most of the community agreed was perfectly balanced and had an amazing power. Today, we're going to take a look at the history of Hillbilly in Dead by Daylight's meta. Let's begin from where it all started, the first day that Dead by Daylight was officially released. When Dead by Daylight first came out back in 14th of June 2016, the choice of killers was very limited, as you could only choose between Trapper, Wraith, and Hillbilly. One quick note that I think is important to know is that the game was playable before the official release, but only Trapper was available in the beta. So for those more experienced players, Wraith and Hillbilly already looked more attractive than the Trapper. Out of these killers, Trapper was the most basic, as all you had to do is put traps around the map. It was a very slow playstyle that rewarded patience and planning ahead. Wraith was invisible, so you could scare the survivors and ambush them in generators or while they're healing. Hillbilly, on the other hand, offered a completely new experience: speed and lethality. Two of the things that people nowadays know are features of the strongest killers in Dead by Daylight. With a very simple power concept, Hillbilly could use a chainsaw to start a very fast sprint to cover the entire map, and also if you catch a survivor, you down them instantly. Remember that during this time, there were no other killers that had the power to actively down a survivor, as only Noed and Trapper's traps could do that. He was extremely fast compared to the other two, as Wraith was not as fast as he is currently in the live game. And finally, there were no indoor maps, so every map was good for Hillbilly. Having a killer chase you with a literal chainsaw with incredible speed was a very scary and intense time for survivors, but everyone liked Hillbilly. All of the survivors had a lot of fun playing against him, and the killers noticed something special about Hillbilly. He was incredibly powerful and incredibly fun to play as. Just like in any other game, the pros started to work and reach the skill ceiling of Hillbilly, inventing new mechanics and techniques, and this is how Hillbilly's first tech was invented: the Flick. Hillbilly had an interesting mechanic, where the hitbox of his chainsaw did not stop at the end of the dash. Instead, it continued for some small time, so you could flick at the end of a chainsaw dash and hit survivors in very impressive angles. This, however, didn't last long, as behavior fixed it because they considered it as an unintended mechanic. Nowadays, the hook tech of Blight is the closest thing that we have, as the dev said that it is an unintended mechanic. Imagine the outrage that it would cause now, because that was basically what happened back then. People said that nobody asked for this was not necessary. Well, those were the main complaints against this nerf to Hillbilly, and it was the first ever nerf to him. The Hillbilly community, however, couldn't stop. They started to find new mechanics and things that could boost the power and strength of Hillbilly in the meta. That was how they found out that binding the keys Q and E of the keyboard in order to turn was better than just turning with the mouse, and combining this with the turning rate add-ons was how the Drift Billy build was invented. However, the true problem began with two builds that most people will know the names of: InstaSaw and Crack Billy. And these two had one add-on that was the culprit of all of it: the Carburetor Tuning Guide. This might have been the most busted green add-on in the game, as it provided with a lot of benefits and not a single downside. Just by equipping this add-on, you had less charge time, less penalty when bumping into things, less chainsaw cooldown, less noise with the chainsaw, and let me repeat myself again, without a single downside. Hillbilly players combined this add-on with the Prime Charger bulb, and the time to start the chainsaw was incredibly absurd. Just to show you a comparison, this is Hillbilly's actual chainsaw rate. This is Hillbilly's charge rate at best, with one very situational charge speed add-on and a purple rarity add-on that reduces Hillbilly's base speed. And this was InstaSaw Billy back in the days with no conditions or situational add-ons. Oh, and did I forget to mention that Tinker worked completely different before its rework, so it's stacked with these add-ons as well. Back then, Tinker increased the power of the charge add-ons for your ability, so killers like Hillbilly could charge the saw faster, Trapper could put his traps faster, Wraith could uncloak faster, Huntress could throw her hatchets faster. In fact, Machine Gun Huntress was a thing thanks to pre-rework Tinker. However, that was the problem of the perk. Due to how it was designed, this meant that every single killer had to have a charge power, which limits their creativity a lot. And when Freddy released, he was the first character in Dead by Daylight that could not get any use of Tinker at all. And just as an extra fun fact, if Tinker wasn't changed to this day, then the reworked Freddy would be able to teleport to gens faster. But anyways, this meant that behavior had to completely change Tinker, and thus Hillbilly got a small nerf to its charging power, but the InstaSaw build was still crazy strong. However, nothing compares to Crack Billy, the strongest build you could have on him. Crack Billy combined the power of the Carburetor Tuning Guide and the Doom Engravings, which increased the speed of his chainsaw at the cost of chainsaw charging. However, even with this penalty, the chainsaw charging speed was still faster than the combo we have in the live game, and it was constant, with no requirements. This build was extremely easy to use on Hillbilly, and it made him way stronger than his base kit. He could move across the map faster, he could down survivors in loops where his base kit wouldn't allow him to, and he still could basically insta-saw you if you were in a dead zone. And the thing about this build is that the Carburetor Tuning Guide, even if you missed a chainsaw accidentally, your bump speed would recover extremely fast. This was the best Hillbilly build in the game, and for many people one of the strongest killers in Dead by Daylight ever, possibly rivaling Blight and Spirit in terms of power nowadays. For years, Hillbilly was at the top of tier lists as the best killer in Dead by Daylight next to Nurse. In fact, some of the players rated Hillbilly even higher than her. But the thing is, most of the community found this fair. While Crack Billy was very strong in chases, the design on Hillbilly's power offered a lot of counterplay to the survivors. It was very fun to get in chases against Hillbillies that tried to chainsaw you, and the reward of hitting a snipe as Hillbilly or getting that curve was one of the best feelings in Dead by Daylight. That was the case until the dreaded 4.1.0 patch. This is one of the most controversial patches in Dead by Daylight, as it's still hated to this day by the Hillbilly community. It's the famous patch that introduced the cannibal reworks as well as some tweaks to Hillbilly. The funny thing is that according to Behavior themselves in the developer update post, they were happy with the way Hillbilly performed, and they even said that for survivors, there is enough counterplay to make Hillbilly one of the most interesting and fun killers to play as and against in the game. The next line of this blog post says that they are only going to do small mechanics for Hillbilly, and they will not remove any of the already present in the game mechanics you can have on him, but they introduced a new one instead, the overheat mechanic. Whereas before you could chainsaw for as much as you want, and you had almost no cooldown after using it, now Hillbilly has to keep track of the heat that the chainsaw produces. So now, traversing the map comes with a cost, as well as using the chainsaws in more complicated loops. For many people, this was already enough to kill the Hillbilly, but Behavior decided to put a nail in the coffin as well by completely massacring almost the entirety of the add-ons of Hillbilly and replacing them with some weird, gimmicky and niche add-ons. Some of them were add-ons like the Big Buckle, which reduced the terror radius for 8 meters while the chainsaw is overheated. The new Heat add-ons, which took most of his arsenal, and one add-on that will always be remembered as the worst add-on in history of the game, Mother's Helpers, which increased Hillbilly's speed by 0.2 meters per second while a flashlight is shining on you. You heard me right. Only when a survivor is aiming a flashlight on you, you would move a minuscule amount faster. Who designed this add-on? For most of the people, this was the death of Hillbilly. This single patch is the reason why Hillbilly got completely ruined. Just ask any killer main nowadays, and most of them will say that the overheat mechanic is the worst balance change ever. So is it just the overheat mechanic and the add-on removal the culprits of Hillbilly's demise? Was it really that bad? I actually don't think so, because I think Hillbilly got it even worse. In fact, I would say that most of the community just says that the overheat mechanic was enough to completely ruin Hillbilly, but I disagree. Even if today the overheat mechanic was completely removed, Hillbilly would still be bad compared to the past. And the sad reason why is that this nerf was even worse than you might have expected. First of all, Hillbilly got another mechanic nerf introduced to him when they added the overheat, which I don't see many people talking about, and that is this weird scream he does when he starts the chainsaw dash. Most people might think that this is just a small change to give Hillbilly some more uniqueness and personality, and you might be right. However, it is also a slight nerf to his mechanics, as it is now a way for survivors to know just with an audio cue when the Hillbilly has started his chainsaw dash. But that is just a small nerf, to be fair. What absolutely killed Hillbilly are map offerings and the new map additions to the game. The last map introduced that was favorable for the Hillbilly is Dead Dog Saloon, as the next map was Midwich, and it is debatable whether this map is good or not for the Hillbilly specifically, but what is non-debatable is that RPD, Eyrie of Crows, the new Haddonfield rework, and Garden of Joy are some of the worst maps ever for Hillbilly, especially this last map with the introduction of the famous Garden of Joy bushes that make it practically impossible to use the chainsaw of Hillbilly on this map. If you don't believe me, just ask any Hillbilly or Leatherface main. With no good add-ons for Hillbilly and an overheat mechanic that hinders new players trying to learn him, as well as the new unfavorable survivor-sided maps where Hillbilly is basically unplayable on, this has made a lot of killers to simply drop him and move on to the next killers. Hillbilly is a very interesting killer that requires a lot of learning and takes a lot of skill to master, more so than the nurse, I would argue. But what is the point in playing and learning a now neglected killer if there are better new killers coming with every update in Dead by Daylight? Why play Hillbilly if the nurse is free? Why play Hillbilly if the Blight can make some amazing plays with less punishment? This has made it so only the fanatics of the chainsaw are the ones that still play Hillbilly to this day, and even then, they themselves admit that Hillbilly is a neglected killer. In fact, he does not even appear in the new banner of Dead by Daylight or in any official collaboration ever. That is the true, sad story of one of the most fun killers to ever be in Dead by Daylight.